This is Musical Talk.
Musical Talk.
The UK's independent musical theatre podcast.
Musical Talk. The UK independent musical theatre podcast.
Welcome to this week's very, very special episode of Musical Talk. I'm Nick Hudson, and I was lucky enough to be able to attend a screening of Into the Woods and also interview Rob Marshall, John DeLuca and Marc Platt, who were all involved in the film's creation. So in this week's episode, you're going to be hearing those interviews, my review of the film with Robert Gordon, and also song clips from the film. So let's get things going with the interview I had with the film's director, Rob Marshall, and the film's producer, John DeLuca.
Once upon a time, in a far-off kingdom, there lay a small village at the edge of the woods.
I wish,
And in this village,
more than anything,
lived a young man.
I've seen the film, and it's the envy of all my friends, because it's it's the film to see at the moment. I was reading about it before I came in, and the interesting thing is, well, I'll let Rob, you tell the story. You, of course, come from Chicago fame, and first I'd like to thank you for putting musical films back on the map.
Oh my goodness, thank you.
You had a meeting with my Lord Sondheim, didn't you? And it all stemmed from there, didn't it?
Yes, after Chicago opened, I sat down with Stephen Sondheim.
As one does.
As one does. I was very thrilled that he wanted to speak to me, and we talked about the idea of turning one of his musicals into a film. And we talked about all of them at that time. Sweeney Todd had not been made yet. This was 12 years ago. And when we got to Into the Woods, he said, I think that would be great for you. Which was wonderful to hear, something that stays with you for many years, believe me. I don't know exactly why he said it. I mean, I can certainly say why I loved it.
Do you think it's because Chicago was so imagination-based, and it was the... Because one thing I want to talk to you about is Sondheim's been famous for saying that someone said to Sondheim, why don't you go into directing, because you're so good at giving notes, as I'm sure you saw.
Yes.
He said he knows about rhythm of the song because that's how he writes it. So when you're directing a musical, which is, you do choreography as well, and how is it that there's more singing probably in Into the Woods than there is dialogue? Is that correct, or would you say it's...
I would say... In some ways, it's a classic book musical. I think there's a lot of dialogue and also song. My great hope, of course, is that you're not aware when either is happening, that it sort of feels seamless. And that's one of the geniuses of, I think, the writing, is that the songs come out of the scene and continue the scene through the song.
So where does your involvement with the pacing and everything stop, and Sondheim's involvement with the rhythm come into film? Because a theatre, you can see everything.
Well, I think one of the great things about this piece, and one of the reasons I actually thought it might work on film, is that opening prologue, which establishes the rules of the piece and the rhythm of the piece.
The 16 minutes.
16 minutes is very similar to what happens on stage in terms of structure, because it's cross-cutting between many different stories. It's moving in and out of dialogue and song, sort of naturally. And that actually made me think early on that this might make a film, because it's very cinematic, that. Instead of one linear story, you're going back and forth between these different worlds and establishing these characters and the rules of how it will be told. And, that's not always the case with musicals. Some musicals just don't, they're too theatrical, too stage-bound to really bring to film. But I thought, this could work. And that was one of my entrees into the piece.
Rob's also amazing in the music department. I mean, Sondheim knew that he was in great hands. I've seen them talk. I've seen the respect they each has to each other. And the way Rob invested his own ideas for the story, it's again that seamless nature of how the words go into the songs is Rob's getting the story with the songs, and it did become seamless. You asked about how the ratio, how much is sung and how much is spoken. It's like
you can't tell.
I almost don't even know, because it all became one as we edited it together. There was no seams the way Rob approached it, and he hears things that any music scholar would be astounded at. He just has an amazing ear. I was a music student, and I was sitting back watching him work with the editor, and it was just an education.
Wow.
And I think Sondheim knew that. And Rob had a great. He was very invested.
Used to Rob, by the way.
He was very invested in the songs and how they would take their shape and the endings of the songs, and we really approached it like a new musical, and they were open to that, not only musically but also lyrically. So
the interesting choice I thought in the film, as opposed to the stage show, is the obvious break between Act 1 and Act 2. What was the choice to not have the button as twerk?
Well, on film you can't really take an intermission. I mean, I think years ago you used to be able to do that, but it doesn't really work now. Movies are different. So you really have to think of it as one piece. So that was one of the biggest challenges. The first thing that James Lapine and myself and John sat down to figure out, how do we do that? And we decided to launch right into it out of Happily Ever After and have the giants, you know, the earthquake of the giant, second giant, Lady Giant, landing, to interrupt that and sort of thrust us into this second act on stage. And that's a big change, but one that needed to happen for film to make it work. We couldn't do the 6 month later kind of thing. And so what's nice about that, it keeps it immediate. It keeps you moving forward in this, makes it one movie as opposed to two movies. And that integration is what makes it a film as opposed to a stage piece. I think it's always important to remember that the stage piece lives forever. That's something you're not going to touch, and that will always live that way. And this needs to be reimagined, because I kind of feel like one of the biggest disservices you can do to a stage piece is to just lift it from the stage and put it on film, because then you've actually hurt.
The producers did that, for example.
Oh, well, there are movies that have happened, that's happened with, and when that and you think that works and you hope that can work, but it never does because it's a different medium. There are songs that, I mean, On the Steps of the Palace on stage is sung directly to the audience. That you can't do on film. It also doesn't happen in the moment. It happens after the fact, which works beautifully on stage. But on film, it's much more exciting to see it happen in the moment. Yeah.
What I also like is that you didn't give in to the Oscar rules and have Sondheim write a new song for the...
Well, we actually did have him write a new song. And we only did that because he's so prolific, and how exciting to have a new Sondheim song. That was thrilling. But the truth is, we put it in the film. We played it for a test audience, and we realized that as great as it was, and it's a great song, and Meryl Streep sings it brilliantly. It will be on the DVD for sure. But it didn't work. It didn't work because it was off story. And it's off story in our last act. And that's a very important act because it changes tone there and the pace changes, and so you have to be very careful. And you didn't, when we watched it with the test audience, it worked brilliantly, but then what happened was you felt the repercussions of it 10, 15 minutes later. And you realized, oh, I see what's happened. We've added something that doesn't serve this film. And so you have to listen to your film and make the very hard decision to take something out. Exactly, people will listen.
Well, no, I mean, directors will admit it's a very hard thing. It's your baby. So for Rob to be able to see that objectively, and then have to tell Stephen and have to tell Meryl, and that this song is not quite, and then he said, I'll just bring them in and show them. And he showed that. He said, of course, you're right. I mean, really the film, as Robbie said, it declared.
It also shows the greatness of the piece as well, that it doesn't need a huge amount of tinkering.
Yeah, exactly. The thing is, you actually have to do the opposite when you're actually bringing a musical from stage to screen. You have to actually make cuts because of the pace, the nature of the two different mediums. You can sit longer for ballads, for instance, and things like that. Ballads on film are very difficult to work because you have to earn them. You can't have one after the next after the next. You have to earn a ballad on film because of the nature of the piece. You know what? And if you saw it, you know, you realize, I mean, it tells you. It's just, it's about, like you said, listening.
And also you pay a lot more to see a film, to see a show in a theatre, so you can get more ballads and more, you know, have a longer experience.
I also think it's because you're in a false place. You're in a theater where you can actually, the pace is a different thing. There is a break usually. There's an intermission for you to sort of fill up and then start again. You know, when you're trying to pull it all together into one piece, there's at 2 hours and 2.5 hours, which is probably what this is on stage. If you put that on film without a break, I think you'd be squirming in your seat, ready to leave.
Well, people also on stage, you see the whole. So there's so many things to be aware of. You really, you don't even realize it when you're watching a theater piece. You watch so much within that proscenium and outside the proscenium so that you can sustain. There's so much to watch. And a film, you're right in there, which is really wonderful when you have Sondheim, because you get every lyric. It was very important for Rob that every lyric be understood, because tells the story.
I have to say that was what I loved most about because there's so much going on lyrically, melody over melody, and you can't get that in a theatre. As much as the sound mix might be, as impressive as it might be, it's really been worked on for 35 speakers in this cinema.
Yeah, no, that's one of the joys of doing it, is you can get into those faces and into those lyrics carefully and closely and really understand them and make them accessible. One of our great achievements, I will say, is that, and we're very proud of this, and it's happening in America as we speak, is that Sondheim is reaching people that wouldn't necessarily see his work, and wouldn't come to the theater, and that's huge. That's a huge.
And he sets a high bar, and it's nice that it's not a lowest common denominator with him ever.
Unless it's ironic.
Exactly. There you go. It's just always something to, and I love that people, as Rob said, are being exposed to that. It's like reading a great book. Everyone gets something different out of it. You won't get everything the first time through, because it's dense and it's rich and there's so many levels to appreciate it on. But everyone comes away with it as part of them, and they have experienced it. And so it's rich. There's a lot going on.
How do you make something as everyone has an image of the fairy tales in their mind and woods? How do you, as a visual filmmaker, make it different?
Well, I think you have great license with a fairy tale to go anywhere. And so I have an amazing team of Dion Beebe, cinematographer, and Colleen Atwood, who did the costumes, and Dennis Gassner, who did the production design. And so you want to use their thoughts and imagery. But one of the most important elements for me personally was, in addition to making it fantastical and magical, I really wanted it to be rooted in the truth, in reality, in a weird way. Because I feel like if you think these characters are just two-dimensional, you won't really feel for them. I wanted them to be three-dimensional, living, breathing people, because you're asked to care for them, especially towards the end. You really should feel for what their journey is, what their wants are, what their wishes are, so that you're with them, caring for them, rooting for them. And the only way to really do that for me is give it a sense of reality. So even in our fantastic fairy tale world, I was really hoping to find as much truth and reality as possible, so you're connected to them.
What I also loved about the film is it like some fantastical films, not that this film is deeply fantastical, but it wasn't all CGI. You went back to some old filmmaking, like The Giant, for example. We had Francis Delator walking over a model, didn't we?
Yes, we did. I love that sort of old-fashioned work, and it's all, for me, comes from a place of wanting the actors to feel like they're in a real place, in a real space. It's very important for me to give the actors that sense and not be in some sort of green space or green room where they can't interact with where they are. And that's what I was talking about before, about giving it a sort of a tangibility, something that's real. And here we are in magnificent England, so to take advantage of castles and towns and beautiful woods with 800-year-old trees, I mean, that's
why waste the money doing CGI.
Well, because you'll never get it as good because of the imperfections of the reality and truth. That's the trees that we're working with. Granny's tree, for instance, where that Little Red Riding Hood goes into, that's a real tree. Jack's tree that he climbs in Giants in the Sky is a real tree. It's thrilling to have that in our piece because there's fantasy that exists in real life. Why not expose that?
And also, what I loved is 2 British orchestras came together for this.
Yeah, that was fantastic. And, to be able to realize this amazing score with Jonathan Tunick's extraordinary orchestrations, with that scale of musicianship and that scale of orchestra, is something you can do on film that you can't do on stage. You can't have a 65-piece orchestra. And how thrilling.
You could if only people paid for it.
You could if people paid for it, but
we didn't want to overproduce it either. That's also a temptation. Like there's this, let's soup everything, let's make it. We kept the reins on that too, because like with anything, you can take it too far.
Yeah, very
but
important.
we tried to balance that as well.
Absolutely.
And do you think there's a difference in? We talked about the sound, but taking the orchestra from a theatre to a cinema, do you think there's a different experience in that as well?
There's a depth to the orchestrations that you can get, and the nuance that you can get.
You can bring out certain themes.
Yes.
Like we had Rapunzel's theme, Over Children Will Listen, which I'd never heard before in the finale.
Yes.
And stuff like that.
Well, his score is so beautiful, but also, in a film you have score as well, underscore. So there's more score based on Sondheim's beautiful, beautiful themes. And so that makes it really exciting to have that, because, there's an entire Giants attack at the end that has to be completely scored from beginning to end. Yeah, so there's those opportunities. We had an amazing music producer that we worked with named Mike Hyam, who did incredible work with us to create that. And so, movies give you that, and we also know movies are forever. So you have to be careful about how you do it, and we were meticulous about the work.
And I guess I should end on, Meryl Streep. Who knew?
Well, I'll tell you, there's nothing she can't do. And
there's a difference between singing ABBA and singing Sondheim.
Well, smart people are still asking me. I just got an email 2 days ago asking, she sounds, but who else did you get someone else to
Marnie
sing?
Nixon come in and do it?
Yes, and I just, number one, that we would never do that. Number one, that would never be part of our vocabulary, is dubbing someone with another voice. But that's her. But not only is her singing voice great, it's what she invests. It's like Rob and I, everybody thinks we hire actors to sing. It's like, no, we hire the character that can get the feelings and the emotion and tell the story through a song. And sometimes it comes out that the person has an amazing technical gift, like Meryl. She can sing a pianissimo note like somebody who's trained their whole life.
She's a great mimic as well, isn't she?
Oh, yeah, of course, yeah. But you have to have the goods in order to, you need to have a soprano instrument and be able to high note. You can as good as mimic as you can be. If you're trying to sing a bass note, for me, I could never do it. I'm a tenor, So she's able to invest every bit of her being into these songs.
I don't think she's ever been asked or challenged this way. Sondheim asks a lot of its actors and singers, and I don't think she'd ever been asked at this level to do that. And I have to tell you, when John and I were in rehearsal with her and she opened up and started to sing, for instance, Stay With Me or Last Midnight, it was incredible, because you had this great material, this great Sondheim score being sung by one of the greatest actors ever. And to see that happen was thrilling. And I'm so glad people get to see that and be surprised by her once again.
Rob Marshall there, and I'm here with Robert Gordon. We're going to be discussing Into the Woods. Hello, Robert.
Hello, Nick.
You and I have both seen the film, and
Yes.
I really, really liked it. I'm going to say on record here, because we're recording it, that I thought it was much less preachier than the stage show. Now, I've only seen one stage show, and that was the Park production. I presume you've seen all the original productions with Bernadette Peters and whoever else.
Well, I've seen the Bernadette Peters on DVD, but I never saw the New York production. I did first see the London premiere with Imelda Staunton and Julia Mackenzie as the witch, and that was, I suppose, in the early 90s, and I think that was a Richard Jones production, and I thought that was absolutely wonderful. I then saw the Donmar Warehouse production in the 90s, and that was great, and I liked the Regent's Park production very well. I have to say I don't quite agree with you. There's bound to be lots of different opinions about this, but I don't think the show is preachy. I think it is fairly didactic, but I mean, fairy stories do often have very clear morals. And I think
but they're not hammered into you like children will listen, children must listen, blah 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 blah.
I think what Lapine and Sondheim do is they disrupt, they deconstruct fairy tales, so they show you the Freudian meaning of fairy tales, and it's not so much the overt messages like children will listen, but they're actually those are sort of cues to seeing what really is going on, which I think is, as in all fairy tales, a journey of self-realization.
The film, though, I thought looked wonderful. Do you agree, Robert?
Yes, I thought the best part of the film was its visual appearance. I must also say that I thought that the score sounded wonderful. I've listened subsequently to seeing the film. I've listened to the CD, and I think I actually think I almost enjoyed listening to the CD more than watching the film. Can I say why? I think I'll say because I felt my biggest complaint against the film is that as good as the performances are, and I think most of the performances are really excellent, I think that Rob Marshall and Lapine, as the screenplay writer, failed to solve one problem, which is often a problem when you transfer any show from stage to screen. Even Shakespeare has the same problem, and it's that if you transfer a stage play to film, obviously you have
stage musical or stage play.
A stage play or a musical. What you have to do is you have to lose some of the language, some of the spoken language, because film is a much more visual medium. And normally, with Shakespeare, for example, they cut the lines radically, even with Shakespeare, because the lines repeat very often in something like Shakespeare what you can actually see visually. And I think it's the same with a musical. I think that a lot of the lyrics and the singing in Into the Woods actually is telling you what's all around you. So it's conjuring up for the audience on stage. And imagine,
I'm walking to grandmother's house.
Yes, I'm walking to grandmother's house, and here is a wolf, and here is the forest, into the woods. Now, when you are in the woods and you see the woods, and somebody keeps singing into the woods to grandmother's house, into the woods, or I'm on my way and there's a cow, all of that stuff becomes completely redundant. And I think the problem is that it's very hard just to chop Sondheim's lyrics around and Sondheim's music, because it's all so carefully thought out and structured, yes. But I think that they did cut it to a certain extent. And so I wonder, I think the problem for me is partly in the editing. I don't think it was edited with enough panache, really. I think that the image didn't always match what was being sung, and sometimes the image overlapped with what was being sung, so you were being sung to, which is probably why, well, I don't know if that's why you find it preachy, but I find the film preachy because I think they're singing about the story, telling you the story, but you're seeing the story happen in action. So I thought, well, one or the other must go. Either we don't need to see so much, or we don't need to hear this endless repetition of the storytelling.
Act 2 didn't seem, well, I use the term loosely, the Act 2, as it is in the musical, didn't seem as long in the film. Because
Well,
there were
yes.
things cut from Act 2.
And I think a lot of critics, to be fair to that opinion, a lot of critics do say that the show is absolutely brilliant in Act 1, the stage show, and it's repetitious in Act 2. But I actually although when I first saw it I didn't like the device of the narrator, I think it's a very wicked and funny, grotesque joke that the narrator gets killed after Act 1. Of course, you don't have a narrator on screen, and I think probably wisely they cut the narrator. There is a bit of narration, which I think James Corden is doing.
The thing is, the whole story is being narrated to the child, because he starts the story again as the film is ending. So I think that was what that idea was about.
Yes, but of course, the show as originally written for the stage is really in two parts. The first is really telling the story, and the second
is deconstructing
it and telling the meaning and undermining your expectations of how it will end. But having said that, I must say I loved the performances.
Yes.
I thought that James Corden was absolutely charming and believable.
Nice voice as well.
And a nice voice. I thought that Emily Blunt was absolutely wonderful. I thought that was an extraordinary performance. I liked the little boy. Gavroche from Les Mis. I liked the Tracy Ullman.
Yes.
I liked the Cinderella.
Pine.
I like Chris Pine. One of the I thought he was especially good. But
I thought Anna Kendrick as Cinderella was phenomenal.
I agree. Yes. But I wasn't crazy about Meryl Streep, and this is, I suppose everybody's got a sort of thing about Meryl Streep now, because she plays every single mature woman on film in Hollywood at the moment.
Now she's singing.
Yes, and I think, well, Glenn Close could have done it just as well, if not better. There are other actresses in Hollywood who could have done it as well, if not better. And what I felt is, and as you often feel with Meryl Streep, she's a brilliant technician. She must have worked on her voice. She did everything right. There wasn't a flaw in the performance. But I felt it...
She did a very good Barbra Streisand impression.
In a way. But I felt that it was a little bit boring, because I thought it was a demonstration in acting skills rather than a sort of spontaneous performance.
I love the agony number, the kind of music video style that we had with the two princes sloshing around in the waterfall. I thought that was very funny.
Yes, though I think, isn't there usually a reprise? And I think the reprise was cut. And I think
doesn't Rapunzel die in the original stage show as well?
Yes, I do.
So it's interesting how someone, probably Disney, have looked at this and said, hang on.
Yes.
Hang on.
It's not as dark as the original, and I think that's because of Disney. And I think that's where, having criticised Rob Marshall and Lapine, I think, given what Disney's restrictions might have been, they probably did a rather good job. Because I think, in a way, a lot of the stuff
they're very faithful to the piece.
But I think a lot of the stuff they did cut was because Disney didn't want it to go quite that far.
One interesting fact, I saw it at a screening for the first time, and I saw it again the second time at a normal, we paid to see it at a normal cinema, and there are lots of kids in the audience. Because it's a Disney film, and because it's Little Red Riding Hood, and it's Rapunzel, and it's Cinderella, a lot of kids are going to see this. And come what we know as the end of Act 1, people got their bags and their coats ready to leave, thinking it was the end of the film. But then they went, oh, we've got to sit down for another hour now.
And that's interesting. And did the children seem to enjoy it?
No. They were shuffling around and anxious and wanting to go, as were some of the adults as well.
It seems to me that it's not a film for children, and it's not a piece for children.
No.
And I wonder, therefore, whether Disney actually did think they could make it into a Christmas movie for the family.
Well,
it's certainly played well in the States, hasn't it?
Well, if you go onto the Internet Movie Database and read the general public's reviews, it's absolutely scathing.
So I wonder who went to see it, because it did very good box office in the States.
I think a lot of the theatre people went on Christmas Day.
Yes.
Very excited. And a lot of the families went thinking it's a good film for the family, and it there's nothing truly offensive in it. There's no gore, there's no blood, but there are toes being cut off and eyes being pecked out and things like that. So,
and I think the moralising, as you say, in the second part must be very difficult for kids to take.
Yeah, and it's almost like, because I remember when the musical, the film was announced, people saying, oh, well, it's obviously just going to be Act 1, isn't it? Because Disney wouldn't allow anything else.
Yes. No, they did better than that. It was an ambitious adaptation.
What did you think of Johnny Depp's cameo as the wolf?
I thought it was a bit redundant. I thought that was one of the things where they wasted a good actor, and I thought where probably the Disney influence may have undermined that performance, because I think Johnny Depp's instinct might have been to go to make it far raunchier and far darker. But I thought I couldn't really quite understand.
Because it's meant to be played by the same person that plays the prince, isn't it? The wolf.
It sometimes is. I don't know if it has to be.
I think
but it often is.
Yeah.
But I think that I didn't really understand the point of the cameo, because it wasn't really funny, and it wasn't really dark and sexual.
Well, I think it was, because the girl playing, is it Lila Crawford, who
Little
played
Red
Annie
Riding
on
Hood,
Broadway,
yeah.
very, very good performer, I thought. She's only about 12.
Yes.
And it's the first time those two roles, the Jack and Little Red Riding Hood, have been played by children.
So it could have seemed like a paedophile.
Yeah. And I think, I don't know if that was intentional,
Well,
hello, little girl. It's all very...
That's why I think they stopped short of making it too sexualised. But to be honest, I didn't think Johnny Depp worked. I think Johnny Depp's a wonderful actor, and I usually love what he does on screen.
Yeah.
But I just didn't think it worked.
Anything else you want to add, Robert?
Well, as you said, I think it was visually beautiful, and though I don't think it was edited in enough detail and with enough pace. And I think that the soundtrack is wonderful.
Did you spot the Little Night Music cameos?
Which were those?
We had when they had the external shots of the ball where Cinderella, she was at the festival. They had a Little Night Music waltz playing.
No, I didn't notice
the Golden
that.
Harp was playing a bit of Little Night Music as well.
But you're a musician, Nick, so you would. I thought the poor old Francis de la Tour. I felt sorry for Francis de la Tour having to play the giant because it was a very unflattering role. But I actually quite liked Simon Russell Beale, even though he didn't appear very much.
And Annette Crosby as well.
Oh, Annette Crosby, well, she's always lovely to watch, but there's a tiny cameo from Annette.
Right, so I presume, dear listener, that you've seen Into the Woods already, but if you haven't, go and see it. And Robert Gordon, thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick.
I'm now going to hand you over to the interview that I did with the producer of Into the Woods. This is my interview with Marc Platt. You're, in the theatre world, your biggest claim to fame is producer of a small show called Wicked.
Indeed.
And now you're here doing Into the Woods. There are sort of similarities to the two pieces, aren't they? Taking fairy tales and twisting them on their head. Witches can be good, all that kind of stuff.
Sure. First of all, they're both musicals, so
yes,
they're similar in that vein, and
both by Steves.
And they're both by Steves. Very good. And they both take familiar characters, and we journey with those characters as they take unexpected turns. And I think that's really how they are connected in some way. Their personalities, their music, their musicality, their textures are obviously very, very different in many, many ways. But in the regard of a retelling of something you thought you knew, or of a telling of it in a different way, that's where they're similar.
Now, it was Rob Marshall and John that came to you with this project, wasn't it? Based on Stephen Sondheim's idea.
Indeed. My history of the End of the Woods is, actually, I'd flirted with it years ago on my own as a producer and sat down with Stephen James, but ended up not pursuing it. And then I have a wonderful relationship with Rob Marshall and John DeLuca, and so anytime they call me and say, would you like to come aboard with us, I always say yes before I even know what the project is. And we last collaborated on 9 together. I produced Rob's sister, Kathleen, when she directed a version of Once Upon a Mattress with Carol Burnett and Tracy Ullman, who's Into the Woods. And
which is quite a camp version, wasn't it? It was almost a lot of fake sets, I seem to remember. It
wasn't that fake. I'm not sure it was supposed to be camp.
Sorry.
That's okay. But it was a lot of fun to make, and Carol Burnett's a real treasure.
He's not shy.
Not at all. As sort of an anecdote, Rob Marshall was one of the first people who came to see Wicked in our very, very early previews just to be supportive. And so he and I have a long history. And so when he and John called and said, we're thinking of Into the Woods, we're going to do a reading, come. Of course, I jumped and went to the reading. And from that moment on, we decided to join together once again. And working with Rob and John is really one of the great professional joys of my career.
Now, the interesting thing about this film, I didn't get to touch on it with Rob, is that Disney are involved. And when news of this film started to appear, everyone said, well, it's obviously only going to be Act 1, because, Disney don't really delve into the darker side. So was it hard to get them interested, or were they on board as well?
Disney developed the material. So Disney was involved from day one. And I don't think it was hard because they were excited about it. I think the challenge was finding the balance, both in terms of adaptation, which is true in any adaptation. How do you take source material that's beloved, whether it's a book, a play, or in this instance, a musical? How do you adapt it in a way that is faithful to its source, does not betray the integrity of its source, and yet creates a unique and different experience in the new medium, in this instance, film? How do you create something cinematically that is as exciting because it's a film that it was when it was in the theater as a musical? That would be true, that challenge, whether it was Disney or not. I think the added balancing act that was required for Disney, because you get a lot with Disney. Disney and fairy tales is a big idea and
they own them in a way, so.
And a big brand, exactly. We did want to balance. We didn't want an audience to assume that because Disney was on it that it was happily ever after, because Into the Woods is not a story of happily ever after. It's quite different. Disney embraced that, and it was really a question of finding a balance so that when a character died, it didn't necessarily need it to be a graphic death.
Yes, because we had a production of Into the Woods in the park here in London a couple of years ago, and they had the very graphic scene of the eyes being pecked out, and that wasn't in the film.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen lots of Into the Woods where you haven't seen the eyes pecked out either. I even saw the Dunmar version here in London, which I love, by the way. I think Sam directed it, Sam Mendes, with Sadie Thompson, and it's terrific. To us, Into the Woods isn't about that. Into the Woods is about these people, these characters, their lives, the journeys they take, the lessons they learn, learning that there are consequences to your wishes, understanding that there's always a giant that lurks among us, and that to confront and deal with that giant and the challenges of journeying through the woods or through life requires us to do it as a community together. And that's what we saw the piece as about, and that is what gets the focus in the film. And
was Stephen Sondheim involved from the beginning, or did he just come in and tick a few boxes and say, yes, that's fine? Or because Rob mentioned a new song was written and then it was cut. Tell us about his involvement. Did he treat it as a new staging?
Well, Rob didn't want to move forward without James Lapine and Stephen being the adapters, the authors of the film, as only they could be. So they were involved in every word and every day in the development of the script and the choices made on how do you bring the play to the screen. And one of the great challenges of that is that a play is in 2 acts. In this instance, and Into the Woods, 2 very distinct acts. Movies are written in 3 acts. So it's a very different rhythm. By the time you get to the 3rd act of a movie, an audience has to know where it's going. It's a rhythmic thing. It's not a length thing. And they have to, once you're in that 3rd act, you got to get to the ending. And so we had
tell when you're in the 3rd act.
100%, exactly. And because the whole entire 2nd act of Into the Woods is in the 3rd act of a movie, a lot of choices had to be made about how to make that all work. And Stephen and James were involved with all of that, and in all decisions. The decisions as to what's in the film once it's filmed were Rob's decisions, but always in collaboration with Stephen and James. So Stephen wrote a wonderful song for the Witch to sing, with Meryl beautifully performed. And in the first cut of the movie, which we all saw, the song was great, but it wasn't that it didn't land. The 3rd act was too much. There were too many ballads in it. There was too much singing in it. And it actually, because she sang in the 3rd act, that's what it was written for, it undercut Last Midnight, which is such a tour de force and such an important narrative song. And once it was removed, it was just self-evident that even though we had to murder one of our babies, so to speak, that the 3rd act soared in a way it hadn't before. And it was evident to Steve and to James and to Rob and to me and to everybody.
Was it one thing which is surprising, or might surprise a lot of people, is that it is a musical. those who don't know the theatre world, and it's not labelled as a musical on the posters. It's not Into the Woods, the musical. Was that a conscious decision? Or?
It was a little bit conscious. I mean, the first teaser that came out had music underscoring from the film, but not singing. But all the materials thereafter did have singing in it. So I actually think that the marketing of the film has done a very good job of contextualizing the film. I don't think people come to it not knowing it's a musical at all. It's a very interesting and different musical because, unlike, for example, Chicago, which Rob did so brilliantly, it isn't a musical in which the songs are numbers. Yeah. They're not production numbers. They're actually scenes. They're sophisticated scenes about feelings and story points and characters' lives. And to seamlessly direct a film where characters are singing scenes is quite an accomplishment, actually.
And it's also not done very often, because a lot of musicals do take the dream sequence and have them as musical numbers, or with the High School Musical, they're either music numbers.
That's right.
But what I loved about Agony was it was almost done as a music video. Well,
kind of. I mean, it is very much organic to its setting. I mean, there are princes walking through a forest without giving too much away. They come upon a waterfalls, and sort of the gymnastics that ensues in their competition serves the lyrics of the song. It serves the dynamics of the characters, and that's what great film adaptation is, and what a great director does. He takes the DNA of what is there, but then puts it up on screen in a way that it could only be done on screen. And the way Rob did Agony, it could only be done in film. You couldn't do that on stage. And yet, it so much is what Agony is about, and how it's performed. It's quite genius.
Tell me about the casting process of this film, because it does surprise a lot of people. I talked with Rob about, we see Meryl Streep sing ABBA, but to sing Sondheim is a completely different thing. You went for actors who you weren't sure if they could sing, or were they tested for their singing first? What was the process like?
Well, Meryl's unique because Meryl can do anything. Meryl is otherworldly. She can do anything she wants to do, and it all comes from character, which matches Steve Sondheim because he only writes from character every one of his songs. But the rest of the cast, Rob always insists that folks audition for him, even movie stars, because you have to know what the instrument is and who can sing in a musical and who can't. He was certainly looking for actors who could sing, because Into the Woods is such a performance piece, but they had to sing, and luckily, and by the way, every movie actor you can think of and many movie stars came in and auditioned for Rob, because actors are so interested in working for Rob. Actors all want to be in musicals, believe it or not, musical films, and also Steve Sondheim is a magnet for talent. So everybody you can imagine came in, and the ones that landed the roles did so because they came in and claimed the roles. I mean, Emily Blunt came in, and I wasn't there that day. I know Rob cried in her audition. It was a full performance in an audition, and so each of these actors who are all so well accomplished, obviously can sing so well. Who knew? And are great actors to boot. So they all auditioned for it.
Not necessarily relating to Into the Woods, but let's take another recent successful film musical where one male performer wasn't as good. Do you think it's wrong to put a star in a film over someone who could do just better justice to the material?
That's a hard question to answer, because I'm not in the shoes of who's ever making that decision. For me as a producer, there's certain compromises I won't make. On the other hand, there might be a situation where if you get this particular star to be in your musical gets made. And if you don't, it doesn't.
Puts bums on the seats.
And so the question is it worth that? And that's a choice for each individual director and producer to make. I can't judge it. I can tell you there have been films where there have been people who haven't sung as well as I wish they did, and the experience wasn't good for me as a moviegoer, a musical lover, but it doesn't mean that's the same for the next person, and the movie got made. And I'm always happy when musical films get made because I love the genre so much.
I thank Rob for putting musical films back on the map, because it all started again with Chicago. So I don't want to get anything out of you, but are there any future projects which you'd like to see turned into any more stage musicals which you would like to see turned into film musicals?
Well, there is that musical about the witch, Wicked, So that will be a film. That the process of making that film has begun. Winnie Holzman, who wrote the play, is writing the screenplay as we speak. So that is in process. I'm developing Stephen Daldry is directing. I'm developing a remake of Little Shop of Horrors at Warner Brothers.
Oh, okay.
You know, whether that gets made or not, we'll see. It's still in the development
Was that
process.
the one with the? Because when I last spoke to Alan, he talked about it, and it was the book writer, the Spanish name I can't remember.
Yes.
Is this the one we're talking about with
Yes.
the original ending?
Yeah.
Yes.
And some changes too in the story.
Okay.
And some changes in the story. Roberto. So there's always a musical, and I'm always working on something.
It's a very exciting time. Marc Platt, thank you very much for talking to me.
My great pleasure. I'm so glad to have had the time.
This episode of Musical Talk, edited and presented by Nick Hudson, and is copyright Musical Talk 2015, apart from the